Everyone in Murilo Barisi's suburban compound understood one truth. Ghost wasn't a pet. The 110-pound bulldog had hospitalized 3 professional handlers, torn through reinforced leather like paper, and once bent the bars of a custom steel crate with nothing but rage. Nobody got within 10 feet of him without Murilo on the other end of that double-chain leash. Not the security team. Not the housekeepers. Not even Murilo's most trusted associates. The dog was a weapon. A living, breathing declaration that the tattooed Italian-American boss controlled everything in his perfectly manicured world, even a beast that couldn't be controlled. So when the back door swung open during a tense Saturday afternoon meeting on the front lawn, and a small boy in a gray shirt wandered onto the driveway, every conversation died mid-sentence. Ghost's head snapped toward the movement. His body went rigid. A growl tore from his chest so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The associates stumbled backward. One of them shouted for someone to grab the kid. Murilo's knuckles went white around the leash. His jaw clenched, muscles straining beneath his open suit jacket as he braced his full weight against 110 pounds of pure, focused violence. But little Lucas Grover didn't run. He didn't scream. He didn't even blink. He just stood there in the middle of the pristine suburban street, blue jeans and worn sneakers, head tilted slightly upward, staring directly into the snarling face of the most dangerous animal any of them had ever seen. Ghost lunged. The chain went taut. Murilo's expensive shoes scraped against concrete as he fought to hold the line, his tattooed chest heaving, his control slipping for the first time in years. And then Lucas did something. Something so quiet, so impossibly simple, that no one standing there could quite believe what they were seeing. Ghost's jaws snapped shut. His entire body shuddered. And instead of tearing forward with that unstoppable rage, the beast everyone feared dropped to the ground, lowered his massive head, and released a sound none of them had ever heard before. A broken, mournful whimper that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient. Murilo Barisi stood frozen on his own front lawn, the leash hanging loose in his shaking hands, watching a child do what he, a man who'd built an empire on fear and force, could never do. Tame the untamable. But what Lucas revealed in that moment wasn't just about the dog. It was about the secret Murilo had been hiding behind his tailored suits and inked skin. A secret buried so deep for his entire life that it took a boy who didn't know how to be afraid to finally drag it into the light. Stay with me until the end, because the silent, impossible act Lucas performs will not only tame the beast that Murilo couldn't control, but change everything you think you know about loyalty. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Murilo Barisi didn't buy the house in Westfield Grove because he needed more space. He bought it because winners lived in places like this. 3 stories of brick and stone on 2 acres of emerald lawn, where the neighbors drove German cars and nobody asked questions about cash transactions. It was a trophy. Proof that a kid from South Philly with a father in Rikers and a mother who cleaned other people's houses could own the kind of address that once wouldn't have let him park on the street. He spent 6 months making it perfect. New security gates that looked decorative but could stop a truck. Cameras hidden in the landscaping. A wine cellar he'd never use and a home theater he'd never watch. Every detail calculated, every corner designed to send one message. Murilo Barisi had arrived, and he wasn't going anywhere. The house was a set piece. But Murilo himself was the show. He moved through his compound like a man who'd studied every frame of every gangster film ever made and decided to do it better. The suits were custom, cut sharp enough to draw blood, always worn with a jacket open to reveal the canvas of ink sprawled across his chest and arms, religious iconography tangled with familiar script, beauty and violence in equal measure. His beard was trimmed with surgical precision. His hair faded to perfection every 4 days. Even his posture was a statement. Shoulders back, chin level, eyes that held contact just long enough to make lesser men look away first. He was 32 years old and looked like he'd been carved from marble by someone who understood power. His associates respected him. His rivals feared him. The old guard watched him with that particular mixture of suspicion and inevitability, knowing that men like Murillo didn't ask permission. They just took what was theirs and dared you to take it back. But every kingdom has its crack in the foundation. Ghost. The Bulldog had been a gift from a Detroit connection, a gesture of respect after a particularly lucrative arrangement. Murillo accepted because refusing would have been an insult, and because the dog fit the image. A beast at the end of a chain, controlled fury as accessory. He'd envisioned the animal as the final piece of the aesthetic. Dangerous, obedient, impressive. What he got instead was chaos in a 100-pound frame. Ghost was magnificent, there was no denying that. Brindle coat over slabs of muscle, a head like a cinder block, eyes that burned with something beyond animal aggression. He was beautiful the way a hurricane was beautiful, from a distance, and only if you forgot what it could do to you. But obedient? Never. Ghost wasn't just aggressive. He was broken, dangerous, unfixable. The dog tolerated Murillo's presence because Murillo fed him and because, perhaps, some primitive part of Ghost's brain recognized that the tattooed man was the only thing standing between him and a bullet. But control. That was a fantasy. Ghost obeyed no commands. The dog destroyed leather furniture worth more than most people earned in a year. He barked with such force that windows rattled in their frames. He once grabbed a solid mahogany table leg during a tense negotiation and reduced it to splinters while the visiting associates stared in uncomfortable silence. His growl could empty a room faster than a pulled weapon. Murillo kept him anyway while mindfully keeping his distance. Admitting failure wasn't in the vocabulary. Besides, a beast nobody else could handle only made the boss look stronger. At least, that's what he told himself. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Saturday neutral ground that happened to be Murillo's front lawn. 3 associates from the Castellano crew out of Newark, 2 of Murillo's own lieutenants, and enough unspoken tension to make the summer air feel thick. They were there to discuss territory, specifically, a strip of waterfront property in Hoboken that both sides had been circling like sharks around blood. Murillo chose the outdoor setting deliberately. Inside felt like negotiation. Outside, with the sprawling house behind him and the manicured grounds stretching in every direction, felt like a demonstration of strength. This was his domain, his rules. And if they didn't like it, they could drive back to Newark and explain to their bosses why they'd walked away empty-handed. He dressed for it. Black suit, crisp white shirt open at the collar. The tattoos visible but not aggressive. Rolex catching the sunlight. Hair perfect. The image of a man who had everything under control. Then he made the decision that would change everything. He brought out Ghost. The dog had been pacing the side yard all morning, restless and agitated in that way that usually meant trouble. Murillo told himself it was strategic. The Castellano crew needed to see that he kept dangerous things close, that he could handle what other men couldn't. Power move. Psychological warfare wrapped in fur and muscle. Marco, his head of security, had objected. Boss, the dog's been off all week. Maybe keep him inside. Murillo waved him off. He'll be fine. I've got him. He didn't. Not really. But admitting that to Marco would mean admitting it to himself. And Murillo Barisi didn't do admissions of weakness. So when the Castellano crew pulled up in their black SUV, Murillo was already positioned on the circular driveway, Ghost at his side on the double-chain leash, the leather wrapped tight around his tattooed fist. The dog's body was tense, ears pinned back, a low rumble emanating from somewhere deep in his chest. The men approached cautiously. Vincent Castellano's nephew, a thick-necked enforcer named Polly, was doing most of the talking. He kept glancing at Ghost, trying not to look nervous and failing. But that was the point. Nice place you got here, Barisi, Polly said. His eyes tracking the dog's every movement. Real domestic. Domestic pays better than you'd think, Murillo replied. His voice smooth, controlled. Ghost shifted his weight, pulling slightly against the leash. Murillo adjusted his grip, making it look casual. They started talking numbers. Percentages. The usual dance of men pretending they were businessmen instead of criminals. Murillo kept his attention split, half on the conversation, half on the animal straining beside him. Ghost's breathing had changed, faster and shallower. His hackles were starting to rise. So we're thinking a 70-30 split, Polly was saying. We handle distribution, you handle. Ghost's growl deepened. One of Murillo's lieutenants, Eddie, took an involuntary step back. Your dog got a problem? Polly asked, his tone shifting from professional to wary. He's fine, Murillo said, tightening the leash another wrap. His forearm was starting to burn from the tension. Just protective. You were saying. 70-30. But Ghost wasn't fine. And somewhere in the back of Murillo's mind, beneath the performance and the posturing, he knew it. The dog was a live wire, and he was holding it with both hands, praying the current didn't surge. It was only a matter of time. The variable Murillo hadn't accounted for was sleeping upstairs in the guest bedroom when the meeting started. Lucas Grover was 7 years old, small for his age, with sand-colored hair that stuck up in the back no matter how much his mother tried to smooth it down. He was the son of Tommy Grover, one of Murillo's newer associates, a finance guy who cleaned money through a network of shell companies and had proven himself useful enough to warrant an invitation to the compound for weekend discussions. Tommy's wife had come along, and Lucas had tagged along because his grandmother was sick and there was nowhere else to put him. The arrangement was simple. The kid stays inside, watches cartoons, doesn't make noise, doesn't exist. Murillo had nodded when Tommy explained it, barely registering the information. Children were irrelevant to his world, invisible until they became old enough to be useful or problematic. Lucas had been content enough at first, sprawled on the leather couch in the media room with a tablet and a plate of crackers. But the house was big and quiet and boring, and when he heard the voices drifting through the open window, low and serious, the kind of adult conversation that always meant something interesting was happening, curiosity won out over instruction. He slipped down the back staircase in his socks, padding through the kitchen where the housekeeper was preoccupied with her phone. The door to the backyard was unlocked. He pushed it open carefully, wincing at the creak, then stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. The voices were coming from the front. He followed them, rounding the corner of the house just as Ghost's growl escalated into something primal. The timing couldn't have been worse. Lucas appeared at the edge of the driveway exactly as the dog lunged forward, exactly as Murillo's grip slipped half an inch on the leather leash, exactly as Polly was mid-sentence about profit margins. The boy stepped into view like he'd materialized from nowhere. Small, curious, utterly unaware of what he was walking into. Ghost saw him immediately. The dog's entire body coiled like a spring. His lips pulled back to reveal teeth designed for crushing bone. The growl transformed into a roar that seemed too large to come from any living thing. Jesus Christ! Eddie shouted, stumbling backward so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet. Polly's hand went to his waistband, instinct overriding reason. One of the Newark guys grabbed his shoulder, hissing something urgent. Tommy Grover's face drained of color. Lucas! Well, get back inside. But Lucas didn't move. He stood there on the driveway in his gray t-shirt and blue jeans, sneakers with the laces tied in uneven loops, staring directly at the 100-pound engine of violence straining toward him. His expression wasn't fear. It wasn't anything Murillo could name. Just attention. Like the boy was trying to understand something that no one else could see. Ghost went ballistic. The leash snapped taut with a sound like a whip crack. Murillo's body jerked forward, his expensive shoes scraping concrete as he threw his full weight backward, both hands locked around the leather, muscles screaming. "Somebody get the kid!" Marco bellowed from somewhere behind them, his voice cracking with panic. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Men scattered. Voices overlapped in a cacophony of curses and contradictory commands. Tommy was frozen, his face a mask of horror. The dog was a battering ram of muscle and rage, and Murillo, the man who controlled everything, who'd built an empire on the foundation of his own unshakable dominance, was losing. And Lucas just stood there watching. Murillo's world narrowed to three things: the leather cutting into his palms, the concrete sliding beneath his feet, and the animal at the other end of the chain that was no longer listening to anything resembling reason. He pulled harder. His shoulders screamed in protest. The tattoos across his chest stretched tight as every muscle in his upper body engaged in a battle he was slowly, inexorably losing. The suit jacket that usually made him look like power incarnate now felt like a costume, flapping open uselessly as he braced his legs and leaned back with everything he had. "Ghost! Down!" The command tore from his throat, raw and desperate, nothing like the controlled voice he used to run meetings and issue orders that men followed without question. "Ghost!" The dog didn't even hear him. Ghost's entire being had collapsed into a singular focus, the small figure standing motionless 15 feet away. The animal's eyes were wild, pupils blown, white foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. His paws scrabbled against the driveway, claws scraping stone, hindquarters bunching and releasing as he threw his weight forward again and again. Murillo felt his grip slip. Quarter inch. Half inch. The leather was slick now, whether from sweat or blood he couldn't tell. His arms were shaking. Not from exertion. Murillo Barisi could hold a 200-pound heavy bag for 3 rounds without breaking a sweat, but from the terrible realization that his strength didn't matter here. Ghost outweighed him by nothing. The physics should have been in Murillo's favor. But physics didn't account for the kind of primal force radiating from the dog, the pure distilled violence of a creature that had transcended training and obedience and entered some realm where only instinct existed. "Somebody grab the fucking kid!" Murillo roared, but nobody moved. They were all locked in place, watching the spectacle of their boss, the man who'd brokered deals with Russians, who'd walked into a disputed card game in Atlantic City with nothing but confidence and walked out with 3 new businesses, who'd built his reputation on being untouchable, losing a battle on his own front lawn to an animal he'd claimed to control. Marco had his phone out, probably calling for backup that would arrive too late. Eddie was pressed against one of the SUVs, his face ashen. Polly and the Newark crew had backed up to the street, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the disaster unfolding. Tommy Grover was shouting his son's name, but it came out strangled, useless. And through it all, Murillo could feel it, the weight of every eye watching him fail. This was the image that would haunt him. Tattooed chest heaving, designer shoes skidding on concrete, face contorted with effort that wasn't enough. Hands wrapped around a leash that might as well have been holding back a freight train. The Italian prince of suburbia, dethroned by his own dog. Ghost lunged again. Murillo's feet actually left the ground for a second before he crashed back down, stumbling forward 2 steps he couldn't afford to give. The chain was at its limit. 5 more feet and the dog would reach the boy. Murillo's vision tunneled. His heart hammered against his ribs. For the first time in his adult life, he understood what true helplessness felt like. Not the calculated vulnerability of a negotiation or the strategic retreat before a bigger victory, but the absolute crushing knowledge that he had no control here. None at all. Ghost was going to reach Lucas Grover, and Murillo Barisi couldn't stop him. But Lucas wasn't running. That was the first thing that registered in Murillo's panic-narrowed awareness. The boy hadn't moved. Not backward, not toward safety, not even a flinch. He stood planted on the driveway like a sapling that didn't understand it was supposed to bend in the hurricane. His small hands hung loose at his sides. His sneakers, scuffed and worn, were shoulder-width apart in a stance that belonged to someone much older, much more certain. And he was staring directly at Ghost. Not the way adults looked at the dog, with wariness, with calculation of distance and threat. Not with the wide-eyed terror of prey that knew it was about to be devoured. Lucas looked at Ghost the way you'd look at a puzzle you were determined to solve, with a focus so complete it bordered on communion. The dog's roar faltered. Just for a split second, a hairline fracture in the wall of sound that had been pouring from his throat. His massive head tilted slightly, one ear twitching forward as if trying to interpret something his eyes were telling him but his rage couldn't process. Lucas tilted his head too. Mirror image. Same angle, same deliberate slowness. Murillo felt it then, a shift in the tension on the leash. Not release but something stranger. Ghost's muscles were still coiled, still ready to spring, but the forward momentum had stuttered. The dog's breathing changed rhythm. Still fast but no longer the mechanical panting of pure aggression. The boy's eyes didn't blink. They were blue-gray, pale in the afternoon sunlight, and they held Ghost's wild gaze with something that looked impossibly like recognition. Not of the dog himself, but of something beneath the fury, something everyone else had stopped looking for because the teeth and the growling were too loud, too immediate, too terrifying to see past. Lucas saw it anyway. Ghost's lips were still pulled back, saliva dripping from exposed canines that could crush bone, but his eyes, Murillo noticed for the first time, weren't the flat, predatory black of a hunting animal. They were wet, almost frantic. The rage wasn't cold calculation. It was heat, fire, the kind of burning that came from something deeper than aggression. Looked like pain. And Lucas somehow seemed to know it. The boy didn't speak. Didn't make any sound at all. He just stood there in his too big t-shirt and uneven shoelaces, holding the dog's stare with an intensity that made the adults around them feel suddenly irrelevant, suddenly intrusive, like they'd stumbled into a conversation that had been happening in a language they'd never learned. The silence stretched. Seconds that felt like hours. Murillo's arms were still locked, still straining, but Ghost had stopped pulling. The dog's body vibrated with tension, with the effort of holding still when every instinct screamed to charge forward, but he wasn't moving. He was locked in place not by the chain around his neck, but by the small figure who refused to look away. Tommy Grover whispered something, a prayer maybe, or just his son's name said like one. Marco's hand hovered near his holster, frozen mid-reach. The newer crew had stopped breathing entirely. And Murillo Barisi, for the first time in his carefully orchestrated life, understood that he was witnessing something he had no framework for, no strategy to counter, no way to control. The boy and the beast were communicating in a language written before words, and all Murillo could do was hold the leash and watch. Lucas's right hand moved. Not fast, not sudden. The motion was so gradual it almost didn't register as movement at all, more like the hour hand of a clock, advancing in increments too small to catch but impossible to deny when you looked away and back again. The boy's palm turned upward. His fingers spread slightly, not reaching, not grasping, just opening. The gesture was ancient, universal, the same one humans had been making since they first approached wild things at the edge of firelight. I'm small. I'm vulnerable. I mean no harm. Ghost's entire body went rigid. The growl died in his throat mid-rumble, cut off so abruptly the silence felt like a physical weight. His hackles were still raised, his stance still aggressive, but something in the architecture of his fury was collapsing inward, folding in on itself like a building losing its supports one beam at a time. Lucas lowered his hand another inch. 2 inches. Moving through the air between them with the kind of patience that shouldn't exist in a 7-year-old standing 15 feet from a dog that could kill him before anyone could intervene. And then Ghost shuddered. It started in his shoulders and rippled down his spine like an earthquake, a full-body convulsion that shook him from skull to tail. His jaws, which had been open and ready, snapped shut with an audible click of teeth on teeth. His eyes, those wild, burning eyes, suddenly looked lost, confused, like he'd woken from a nightmare and didn't recognize where he was or what he'd been doing. The sound that came from him next made every man on that driveway take an involuntary step back. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a bark. It was a whimper, high and broken and so profoundly mournful that it seemed to pull the air itself into something heavier, sadder, harder to breathe. The kind of sound that belonged to creatures who'd lost something irreplaceable and didn't have the words to explain what or why or how to get it back. Ghost's front legs buckled. His massive frame dropped to the ground, chest hitting concrete with a dull thud that should have hurt but didn't seem to register. His head lowered slowly, as if the weight of it had finally become too much to hold up. The animal that had been pure violence seconds ago now looked like he was surrendering to something much larger than fear or rage, something like grief. His muzzle came to rest inches from Lucas's worn sneakers. Not aggressive, not threatening, just defeated, broken open. Lucas's hand completed its descent, settling gently on the broad space between Ghost's ears. The boy's fingers were tiny against the dog's massive skull, barely covering the width of bone and muscle, but they rested there with absolute certainty. No hesitation, no fear, just touch. Ghost's eyes closed. Another whimper escaped him, quieter this time, almost like a sigh. The leash went completely slack in Morilo's hands. He stood frozen, his arms still extended. His body still braced for resistance that was no longer there. The leather hung in loose loops between his white-knuckled fists and the dog that had stopped being a weapon and become something else entirely. Something Morilo didn't have a name for because he'd spent his whole life making sure he never had to feel it. Around them, the world stayed silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just stared at the impossible tableau. The tiny boy with his hand on the broken beast, and the Mafia boss who'd lost control of everything he thought he owned. Tommy Grover moved first. He crossed the distance in 3 long strides, his face still bloodless, and scooped Lucas up by the armpits with the kind of desperate efficiency that came from pure parental terror finally finding an outlet. The boy didn't resist. His hand slipped from Ghost's head as he was lifted, his expression unchanged. Still that same calm, focused look, like he'd just finished a task that needed doing and was content to let the adults handle the rest. Inside. Now. Tommy's voice cracked on the second word. He didn't wait for acknowledgement, just turned and carried his son toward the house at a pace just short of running, one hand cradling the back of Lucas's head like he was made of glass. Ghost didn't follow. Didn't even lift his head. He stayed exactly where he'd collapsed, chest pressed to the concrete, muzzle resting in the space where Lucas's sneakers had been. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. The rise and fall of his breathing was slow, labored, like each inhale required effort he barely had left to give. Morilo looked down at the animal and saw something he'd never seen before. Defeat. Not the temporary submission of a dog that would bite again when the moment came, but the profound exhaustion of a creature who'd been holding himself together through sheer force of will and had finally, catastrophically, come apart. The leash was still in Morilo's hands. He realized he was gripping it so hard his knuckles had gone white, the leather cutting deep grooves into his palms. He tried to relax his fingers. They wouldn't respond. His hands were shaking, not the tremor of exertion, not the adrenaline come down after a fight, but something worse. Something that started deeper and felt like it might not stop. He'd been helpless. Completely, utterly helpless. And everyone had seen it. The silence stretched. Marco was staring at Ghost with an expression somewhere between confusion and horror. Eddie had his phone out but wasn't looking at it, just holding it like a talisman. The newer crew stood clustered by their SUV, exchanging glances that said more than words ever could. What the fuck just happened? Did we really just see that? Is Barisi going to address this, or are we all going to pretend it didn't happen? Polly cleared his throat. Oh. Maybe we should reschedule. The words landed like stones in still water. Morilo's jaw tightened. He wanted to say something sharp, something that would re-establish control, reassert the image that had just been shattered on his own driveway. But his throat felt sealed shut. The words wouldn't come because he didn't know what words could possibly contain what had just happened. A 7-year-old boy had done what he couldn't do. Had seen what he'd refused to see. Had reached something in Ghost that Morilo hadn't known existed because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that the dog wasn't a weapon, wasn't a tool, wasn't an extension of his power, was just a damaged thing in pain. And pain was something Morilo Barisi had spent his entire adult life teaching himself not to feel. Yeah. His voice came out rough, barely recognizable. Reschedule. Polly nodded, relief flickering across his face. The newer crew moved as a unit, backing toward their vehicle with the careful movements of people leaving a crime scene. No handshakes, no pleasantries. Just a quiet exodus that felt more like retreat. Marco approached cautiously. Boss. You want me to leave him? Morilo's eyes were still on Ghost. The dog hadn't moved. Hadn't made a sound. Just lay there like something essential had been removed, and he didn't know how to function without it. Morilo knew exactly how that felt. 3 days passed before Morilo could bring himself to make the call. 3 days of Ghost lying in the side yard like a statue, barely eating, moving only when necessary. 3 days of Morilo watching from the upstairs window, unable to shake the image of Lucas's small hand resting on the dog's head, unable to forget the sound of that whimper, broken and ancient and familiar in a way that made his chest tight. He told himself it was about control, about understanding the asset, fixing the liability. But at 3 a.m. on the 4th day, staring at the ceiling while his mind replayed the standoff frame by frame, Morilo admitted the truth to the darkness. He needed to know. Not for the business. Not for the image. For himself. He called Dominic Reyes at dawn. Dom was the kind of man who didn't exist on paper. No social media, no credit cards, no permanent address. He specialized in information that people wanted buried. Financial records that had been shredded, relationships that had been severed, histories that had been carefully erased. If you needed to know something that someone else needed to stay hidden, you called Dom. And you paid him very, very well. I need everything on a dog, Morilo said when Dom picked up on the 3rd ring. No greeting. No small talk. Brindle Bulldog, approximately 4 years old, came to me through a Detroit connection 6 months ago. I want his history. Every owner, every trainer, every kennel, every fucking veterinary visit. I want to know where he came from and what happened to make him what he is. There was a pause on the other end. Dom didn't ask questions. That was part of what made him valuable. But Morilo could hear the curiosity in the silence. Timeline. Dom asked finally. Yesterday. It'll cost extra for Rush. I don't care what it costs. Another pause. You got a name for the dog? Ghost. Registration papers. Microchip number. Anything. Morilo realized he didn't. He'd accepted the animal like a gift-wrapped package and never looked deeper than the teeth and the muscle and the reputation. Find it. There has to be a paper trail somewhere. Detroit contact was a guy named Jimmy Scolari. Start there. Scolari. Dom's voice shifted, became more focused. Yeah, I know that name. Give me 48 hours. 24. Morilo. 24 Dom. This isn't negotiable. The line went quiet again. Then. All right. 24. But you're paying triple rate. Done. Morilo ended the call and stood at the window, looking down at Ghost's still form in the grass below. The dog was awake. His eyes were open, tracking movement Morilo couldn't see. But he wasn't the same animal that had nearly killed a child 4 days ago. That version of Ghost had been fury incarnate, Unstoppable force, pure kinetic violence. This version looked hollowed out, like someone had reached inside and removed something vital, leaving only the shell behind. Murillo pressed his palm against the cool glass. His reflection stared back at him. Sharp beard, expensive haircut, tattoos visible through the thin white t-shirt he'd slept in. The image of power, the performance of control. He wondered what would be left if someone reached inside him and removed the thing he'd built his entire life around. 23 hours later, his phone buzzed. Text from Dom. Got it. You're not going to like it. Murillo's jaw tightened. He poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey even though it was barely noon, sat down at his desk and called back. Tell me everything, he said when Dom answered. And Dom did. Dom's voice came through the line flat and professional, the way it always did when the information was bad. The dog was bred in a facility outside Cleveland. Small operation, family run, specializing in temperament over appearance. Ghost, his registered name was Kingston's Shadow, was part of a litter of 3. 2 males, 1 female. The breeders kept detailed records. Kingston bonded with his brother within the first week. Not unusual, but the attachment was extreme. They wouldn't eat unless they were together. Wouldn't sleep apart. The breeder's notes mention it specifically. Said she'd never seen that level of dependency in 30 years. Murillo took a drink. The whiskey burned going down but didn't warm anything. At 8 months, a buyer came for 1 dog. Offered double the asking price for the brother. Breeder tried to sell them as a pair, explained the bond, but the buyer only wanted 1. Said he didn't have space for 2. Pause. She sold him anyway. Business is business. The words landed like a fist to Murillo's sternum. He thought of Ghost's eyes in that moment on the driveway. Wild, yes, but not empty. Full of something too big to contain. The separation was immediate, Dom continued. No transition period, no gradual adjustment. One day they were together. The next, the brother was gone. Kingston stopped eating for 6 days. Threw himself against the kennel door until his shoulders were raw. The breeder couldn't place him after that. Every potential owner walked away within an hour. Too aggressive, they said. Too unstable. Murillo's grip tightened on the glass. He knew where this was going. He bounced through 3 owners in 2 years. Last one was a trainer in Detroit who specialized in protection dogs. Jimmy Scolari's guy. Training method was old school, pain compliance, intimidation, force. By the time Kingston landed with Scolari, he'd learned that everything soft gets taken away. Everything you love disappears. So you become hard. You become the thing they're afraid of before they can hurt you first. Stop. The silence stretched. That's it. Murillo's voice was barely above a whisper. That's it. Ghost wasn't born vicious. He was made that way. By loss, then by everything that came after. Murillo ended the call. He sat in his office surrounded by expensive furniture and framed photographs of himself with people whose names meant power, and felt something crack open in his chest. Lucas hadn't tamed a monster. He'd recognized a mirror. The boy had seen past the teeth and the rage to the thing underneath. The wound that never healed, the attachment that got severed, the part of yourself you bury so deep you convince everyone, including yourself, that it never existed. Murillo looked down at his tattooed arms. Each mark told a story he'd chosen. Each line covered something older, something true. His father's last visit before Rikers. His mother's hands raw from chemicals. The version of himself who'd cared about things that didn't make him stronger. He'd built an empire by becoming untouchable. Ghost had survived by becoming untamable. Neither of them had stopped bleeding. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please write in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, as your support is essential for me to continue creating content like this.